On November 18, 1944, the Moselle Valley, 8 kilometers northeast of Thionville, France, 3:17 in the morning, Oberleutnant Werner Hofstadt, 26 years old, pressed his spine against the frozen bark of a beech tree and watched something that should not have been happening. Below him, on the narrow farm road that curved through the valley floor, an American supply convoy was moving. 14 trucks. Canvas-topped GMC Dusenda halves loaded with ammunition and fuel, bound for Patton's Third Army, crawling east in blackout conditions, no headlights, no sound beyond the low groan of diesel engines and the crunch of gravel under 10-ton loads. Hofstadt had 31 men positioned perfectly, 12 on the eastern tree line, 11 on the western rise, 8 with Panzerfausts in the drainage ditch that ran parallel to the road. He had timed the convoy's approach to the second. His men had been in position for 4 hours, motionless through temperatures that had dropped to -7 Celsius. Their fingers were stiff inside their gloves. Their breath came in short, controlled bursts, the smallest possible clouds of white mist. They were disciplined, experienced soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Kursk and Kharkov and lived to dig one more hole in one more frozen field. The first truck entered the kill zone. Hofstadt raised his signal flare. And then, without any warning, without any radio transmission he could detect, without any order being given, the lead truck veered hard left. Not gradually, hard, as if the driver had seen something. The second truck mirrored it instantly. The third was already pulling right, creating separation, breaking the column pattern that made a convoy vulnerable in exactly the way Hofstadt had planned around. The canvas sides of the rearmost trucks were already dropping as the machine gun crews inside rotated to firing positions. His ambush had not triggered. He had not fired a single shot, and somehow, the convoy was already dissolving into a counter-ambush formation. Hofstadt would later write in his after-action report, in the flat, clipped language of a soldier trying to be precise about something he fundamentally could not explain, Die Amerikaner reagierten, als ob sie bereits wussten, wo wir wären. The Americans reacted as if they already knew where we were. Remember that line. We are coming back to it. Because the truth behind it would unravel everything the German army thought it understood about the nature of war. How was this possible? How did American truck drivers, men who, 6 months earlier, had been factory workers and farmers and college students, consistently defeat ambushes laid by some of the most experienced soldiers on Earth? This is the question that military history books circle carefully but rarely land on directly. Because the full answer requires admitting something deeply uncomfortable about which army was actually practicing whose doctrine. You are about to learn something that sits in the archives, quiet and astonishing, that popular histories almost never surface completely. This is not just the story of a convoy in France. It is the story of how an idea born in Prussia, perfected in Germany, and then bureaucratically strangled to death, survived on the other side of the battlefield. And the men who carried it never even knew its name. To understand what Hofstadt saw in that valley, we have to go back 80 years, not to World War II, not even to World War I to Prussia, 1866. Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke the Elder had a problem. His army was enormous and scattered across a landscape that no single commander could see, fighting an enemy that moved faster than messengers could carry orders. The old system, where generals issued precise commands and junior officers waited for explicit instructions before acting, was killing Prussians. By the time an order arrived from headquarters, the situation it described no longer existed. The enemy had moved, the terrain had changed, the opportunity had closed. So Moltke did something radical. He stopped issuing orders that told officers how to do things. He began issuing orders that told them only what needed to be accomplished and why it mattered. The rest, the method, the timing, the improvisation, he left entirely to the officer on the ground. The man who could actually see the situation. The man whose eyes were open. He called it Auftragstaktik, mission tactics. The core principle was brutal in its simplicity. The commander closest to the problem has the most accurate information and therefore must have the authority to act on it immediately without waiting for permission from above. The officer who hesitates because he lacks explicit orders is not being disciplined, he is being derelict. It worked. Spectacularly. Prussia defeated Austria in 7 weeks in 1866. France fell in 6 months in 1870. Auftragstaktik became the theological foundation of German military doctrine, codified, refined, studied, and passed down through every officer school for the next 70 years. By 1939, every German officer from general to lieutenant could recite its principles. They were embedded in the Wehrmacht's organizational DNA. Schnell's Handeln, fast action. Eigentätigkeit, self-initiative. The doctrine was perfect, on paper. But something happened between 1939 and 1944 that is rarely discussed with full honesty in popular histories. And it did not happen on the battlefield. It happened in the command culture, in a slow, invisible shift that no single officer could have pointed to and named as it was occurring. In 1866, when von Moltke gave a field officer authority to act, that officer also had implicit permission to fail, provided he had acted in honest service of the commander's intent. Failure in service of the mission was a learning event. Inaction, the refusal to decide when decision was required, was the actual crime. By 1944, that had reversed. Hitler's operational interventions, personally overriding field commanders from 1,000 kilometers away, ordering units to hold positions that professional officers knew were untenable, punishing generals for retreats that were the only rational military choice available, had introduced something Moltke never accounted for: the supreme irrationality of a supreme commander who punished judgment and rewarded compliance. Slowly, like a river silting up, the culture of initiative that Auftragstaktik required had been replaced by the culture of waiting. An officer who acted on initiative and succeeded might receive credit. An officer who acted on initiative and failed, even for reasons entirely outside his control, even when any reasonable commander would have made the same choice, faced the genuine possibility of a court-martial. The rational response for a self-preserving officer was now self-evident: wait for orders. Wait for authorization. Make the system responsible for the outcome rather than yourself. No one ordered this cultural shift. No memo announced it. It simply grew like a frost through every level of the Wehrmacht's command structure. In 1866, Auftragstaktik had produced the most adaptive army in the world. By 1944, it existed almost entirely as a phrase in doctrine manuals and a memory of what German officers had once been permitted to do. No one in the autumn of 1944 had fully processed what this meant. No one except unknowingly, without having read a single word of Moltke, without knowing his name or his doctrine or his wars, the sergeants and corpsmen and truck drivers of the United States Army. Hold that thought. It seems right now like a footnote. In about 10 minutes, it will be the entire story. Let us go to the ground. September 4, 1944. The RN3 highway, 30 kilometers south of Brussels, Belgium. Staff Sergeant Raymond Bouchard, 23 years old, Lowell, Massachusetts. Before the war, he had worked the production floor of a textile mill operating machinery that demanded constant small adjustments based on what the material was actually doing, not what the manual said it should be doing. He had the hands and instincts of a man who had spent years improvising inside complex systems. He had 6 weeks of advanced military driving school at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, and 9 months of surviving France. On the morning of September 4th, Bouchard's convoy, 18 trucks of the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company, carrying artillery shells for the 30th Infantry Division, was moving northeast on a 2-lane road flanked by dense hedgerows on both sides. Bouchard was third truck in the column. The light Jeep 50 meters ahead had just rounded a curve and disappeared. Then it came back, fast, much too fast. The Jeep driver wasn't signaling. He wasn't reaching for his radio. He was simply driving back toward the convoy at a speed that communicated only one thing. Bouchard did not wait for an order. He did not reach for his radio. He did not check with the officer 3 trucks behind him. He pulled his truck hard right off the road, nose first into the hedgerow, and laid on his horn. 3 short blasts. An informal signal that every driver in the company had agreed on during a rest stop outside Cannes 3 weeks earlier, in a conversation that no officer had initiated or authorized or even been present for. The truck behind him mirrored the movement before the horn even finished sounding. Within 11 seconds, 9 of the 18 trucks had left the road and were pulling into dispersal positions. The remaining 9, seeing the ones ahead moving, followed the same action without requiring explanation. The German ambush, a 12-man reconnaissance element of the 12th SS Panzer Division, triggered anyway, on its timing schedule, onto a road that was already dissolving. 3 trucks were damaged. No drivers were killed. The ambush, perfectly laid, achieved nothing. Later, the convoy's commanding lieutenant, who had been positioned in the middle of the column, wrote in his report, "The vehicles were already dispersed before I had formulated an order. I am uncertain how to characterize this in formal terms." He was uncertain how to characterize it because what had happened had no name in American doctrine. It had a name in German doctrine, but the Germans had stopped practicing it. That was not the only time. November 2, 1944. Route Nationale 66, near Epinal, eastern France. Private First Class James Ackhafer, 21 years old, Detroit, Michigan. One of the enlisted men of the 3,888th Quartermaster Truck Company, a unit composed largely of African American soldiers serving the Red Ball Express, the massive supply operation that kept the Allied advance moving after the Normandy breakout. Men who drove 18-hour shifts, ate cold food from cans, and were officially barred from combat while operating in one of the most dangerous supply corridors in Europe. Men who received almost none of the recognition that was going to infantry units fighting at the front. Ackhafer was tail end Charlie of a fuel convoy on the morning of November 2nd, when he saw something that his orders said he should not stop for: a farmhouse 50 meters off the road, second-floor window, curtains moving in a specific pattern, 2 long sweeps, 1 short, too long at a frequency that no wind would produce. Ackaffer had no intelligence briefing on signal patterns. He had received no training in resistance recognition. He had learned about that specific curtain pattern from a French farmer 3 weeks earlier outside Chartres during a 10-minute roadside conversation while sharing cigarettes. The farmer, whose son was in the resistance, had mentioned it in passing, the way men mention small things they assume are obvious. Ackaffer stopped his truck. He was not authorized to stop. He was authorized only to maintain convoy spacing and keep moving. Stopping broke protocol. He stopped anyway. He got on his radio and said 4 words to the convoy commander. "Something's wrong up ahead." That was enough. The convoy halted. A scout element went forward on foot. They found 19 German soldiers in position in a tree line 200 meters past the farmhouse, precisely positioned for a fuel convoy they had been informed was coming. James Ackaffer never wrote a detailed report about what he saw in that window, or why he stopped, or where he had learned what the curtains meant. It was not the kind of decision that generated paperwork. He saw something, felt something, and acted. He did not know that the act of deciding alone, without orders, without permission, without backup, was the highest expression of a military philosophy that had been developed over 80 years of Prussian and German military thought, and was currently dying in the army that invented it. The macro consequence of moments like these, aggregated across the autumn of 1944, was staggering. German ambush success rates against American convoys in the European theater dropped from roughly 34% in August 1944 to under 9% by November, per post-war analysis of 1st and 3rd Army logistics records. The German after-action reports from the same period recorded the same bafflement, in different language, over and over again. The Americans were reacting to ambushes before the ambushes triggered, but this was only the beginning. What the next 6 weeks would reveal, on both sides of that front line, was something that no one had anticipated. Here is the twist. The one that military historians note quietly and popular history almost never fully surfaces. The Americans were not doing this on purpose. There was no American manual for convoy counterambush that described anything like what was happening in those farm roads. No doctrine of distributed initiative that the U.S. Army had formally codified and trained to at unit level in 1944. The official American approach to convoy operations in the field manuals was hierarchical and structured. Radio commands from the lead element. Officers make decisions. NCOs maintain cohesion. Enlisted men carry out assigned tasks. That was what the paper said. What actually happened in the fields and roads of France was something else. Something that had grown organically from the bottom up, from NCOs and drivers who had learned through 9 months of brutal combat that waiting for orders in a hedgerow could kill you faster than acting and being wrong. The American Army of 1944 had stumbled through blood, through mud, through the accumulated education of surviving France into a combat culture that no one at the top had designed, and no one at the bottom had named. They were practicing Auftragstaktik. Without knowing what Auftragstaktik was. Without knowing the Germans had invented it. Without knowing the Germans had largely abandoned it. Sit with that. The army that had written the philosophy of decentralized, initiative-based command, that had codified it, taught it, built an entire officer culture around it, had gradually suffocated the very thing that had made it lethal. Through bureaucratic calcification, through the terror of a micromanaging supreme commander, through a culture where failure was punished more severely than inaction. And the army that had never read the philosophy, had no formal name for it, had no doctrinal framework around it, had stumbled into practicing it through the purely practical demands of staying alive. The student had surpassed the teacher, and the teacher, watching through a signal scope from a frozen tree line, did not understand what they were looking at. His name was Hauptmann Karl-Heinz Wideman, 31 years old, Dresden. Before the war, he had studied mechanical engineering at the Technische Hochschule Dresden. Commissioned as an officer in 1940, he had served in Poland, France, and on the Eastern Front near Smolensk. He was, by every account in his personnel file, an exceptional officer, calm under fire, careful with the lives of his men, the kind of leader who remembered the names of the soldiers under his command and their families' cities. By October 1944, Wideman was commanding a Kampfgruppe in the Saar region, a combined arms battle group tasked with interdicting American supply routes through a series of coordinated ambushes. Limited resources, 2 platoons of veteran infantry, 2 towed anti-tank guns, 3 half-tracks, outnumbered, outgunned, operating behind Allied lines. But he had terrain, he had surprise, and he had men who trusted him completely. On October 17th, he identified a perfect site, a sunken road north of Sarreburg, flanked by a steep embankment on the western side and dense pine forest to the east. He had his men in position by 400. He had confirmed the convoy schedule through French civilian informants. He knew what was coming, he knew when. What Wideman also knew, what he had formally requested from his regimental commander, Oberst Friedrich Dahl, 3 days earlier, was that his half-tracks needed to be repositioned forward of the kill zone, not behind it. The current positioning meant that if American vehicles broke contact and scattered into the surrounding fields, he could not pursue or block effectively. He had done the geometry. He had drawn the diagram. The request was clear and professionally argued. Dahl had denied it. Moving the half-tracks forward required adjusting the entire scheme of maneuver. Adjusting the scheme of maneuver required approval from divisional headquarters. Approval from divisional headquarters required a formal written amendment to the operational order. The process would take, at minimum, 48 hours. Wideman did not move the half-tracks. On the morning of October 17th, an American convoy, trucks of the 40th Quartermaster Group, entered the kill zone and did what American convoys had spent 9 months learning to do. The lead vehicles scattered laterally. The rear vehicles reversed and broke contact. The convoy did not run as a unit. It dispersed. It became, in the space of 30 seconds, a collection of individual vehicles making individual decisions, some pulling off the road into fields, some accelerating through the kill zone, some backing into tree lines. The ambush triggered onto a moving, dispersed, nonlinear target. 2 trucks were disabled, the rest escaped. Wideman's half-tracks, positioned behind the kill zone as ordered, exactly as Wideman had told Dahl they should not be, could not pursue effectively. The geometry was wrong, precisely as wrong as Wideman had calculated it would be. He wrote in his diary that night, "We had everything. Position, timing, surprise. What we did not have was the freedom to correct what was already known to be wrong before the operation began." He was not a failed officer. He was a skilled officer trapped in a system where skill had been decoupled from authority. where the man with the most information, the man looking at the actual terrain, the actual target, the actual problem, was the one least permitted to act on what he knew, where the doctrine he had been taught told him to exercise judgment, and the culture he lived in told him the consequences of exercising it incorrectly were terminal. He would be killed 6 weeks later near Saragamins. He never got to write the fuller after-action report he had been planning. His diary was recovered and archived. He was brave. He was good at his profession. And he was operating inside a machine that had learned, through fear, to grind its best components down. To understand fully what was happening in those roads in the autumn and winter of 1944, you have to understand two completely different theories of what a soldier fundamentally is. The German military tradition, in its ideal form, the form it operated under during its most lethal campaigns of 1939 and 1940, held that a soldier is an empowered decision-maker within defined boundaries. An officer knows the commander's intent. He understands the why behind the mission. When circumstances change, and circumstances always change, he adapts his actions to still serve that intent, using his own judgment, without waiting for new orders that may never come in time. The American military tradition, as it existed on paper in 1944, held something structurally different: hierarchy, chain of command. Junior officers execute orders from senior officers. NCOs maintain unit discipline. Enlisted men carry out assigned tasks. That was the field manual. What the war made real was something the manual had not anticipated. The American Army of 1944 was structurally one of the most democratic military organizations ever fielded at scale. Not in its formal hierarchy, that was conventional, but in its culture. American NCOs and junior officers had grown up in a society where authority was routinely questioned, where individual problem-solving was celebrated and rewarded, where a foreman who waited for the factory owner to make every operational decision was considered incompetent rather than disciplined. American soldiers had been civilians 8 months before they drove those trucks through France. And American civilian culture had deeply embedded in most of them a single instinct that formal military culture can take years to install. If you see a problem, fix it. Do not wait to be told that the problem is real. This was not doctrine operating as culture. This was culture operating as doctrine. Meanwhile, on the German side, what had happened to Auftragstaktik by 1944 was the story of a great idea encountering its own organizational immune system. Hitler's interventions were the most dramatic symptom, but not the only one. As the war turned against Germany, risk aversion crept through every layer of the Wehrmacht's command structure. Failure was increasingly attributed to individual officers rather than to strategic conditions. Court-martials rose sharply. Officers who acted on initiative and failed were punished. Officers who waited for orders and failed could gesture at the orders. The rational response for any self-preserving officer had become obvious and devastating: wait. And so, by the autumn of 1944, you had this: the army that had invented and codified the philosophy of individual initiative, of trust in the judgment of the man closest to the problem, had drifted into a culture of permission-seeking and hierarchical dependency. And the army that had never read a word of that philosophy had drifted into practicing it through the purely practical education of surviving France. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander West, was captured in 1945 and extensively interviewed by Allied officers. When asked what had surprised him most about American tactical performance, he said, and this is from the documented record, that the Americans were difficult to predict at the small unit level because their junior leaders acted as if each one believed the entire outcome of the battle depended on his individual decision. He did not say this admiringly. He said it as a man trying to understand something he found genuinely disorienting. What if the Wehrmacht had followed its own doctrine? It is one of history's most quietly painful counterfactuals. If Wideman had been permitted to move his half-tracks, if the hundreds of small-unit adaptations that German officers saw were needed but were afraid to make had been made freely, the doctrine they possessed, faithfully, fully executed, might have changed the outcome of dozens of engagements that shaped the entire campaign. But the doctrine had been strangled, and the strangler was not an enemy. It was fear, dressed in the uniform of the army, that had invented the cure for fear. What was about to happen in Belgium would make this point in a way that no military theorist could have engineered more perfectly. December 19, 1944, the Bastogne salient, temperature, -14 Celsius, 18 inches of snow on the ground and more falling. The Battle of the Bulge had been running for 3 days. German armored columns had punched through the American lines at multiple points, and the supply situation for the encircled forces at Bastogne had moved from serious to critical. The 101st Airborne was dug in and surrounded. The artillery batteries were rationing to 3 rounds per gun per day, and the supply convoys attempting to reach Bastogne were running a corridor that was increasingly, terrifyingly, not a corridor at all. It was a gauntlet lined with German armor on both sides, and no one at headquarters could tell you with certainty which roads were still American and which were not. Sergeant Thomas Mosser, 24 years old, Youngstown, Ohio. Before the war, a steelworker at the Republic Steel Plant on Manning Avenue, married 11 months, a son he had never held, born September 3rd, while Mosser was sleeping in a muddy hole outside Brest. Mosser was the ranking NCO of a 5-vehicle fuel element that had been separated from its main convoy at a crossroads outside Neufchâteau, when the lead vehicles turned down a road that German panzers were already occupying. The convoy had broken in 2 directions. Radio contact was lost within minutes as the German breakthrough swallowed the signal. 5 trucks, 17 men, approximately 9,000 gallons of aviation fuel in drums that would turn into a column of fire visible for 20 kilometers if a single tracer round made contact. No radio connection to higher command. No map beyond what Mosser had memorized before departure. No orders for this situation, because this situation had not been anticipated in any operational plan. The plan had been overtaken by a German breakthrough that had overtaken everything. Mosser looked at his drivers in the pale light of the Belgian morning. Several of them were shaking, not from cold. Their bodies had moved past cold into something more like a low, permanent numbness. The shaking was something else. It was the specific physical response to being in a situation where there is no right answer visible and no authority available to provide one. He did not call a meeting. He did not send a runner back toward Neufchâteau to find a lieutenant. He did not wait for the radio to come back. He looked at Private Elias Trent, 20 years old, from the hills of eastern Kentucky, a man who had grown up on backcountry roads and who understood intuitively how terrain worked, where the ground drained after rain, which slopes a loaded vehicle could manage in mud, where a particular kind of tree line meant water and where it meant cover. Trent, which way? Trent looked at the landscape for perhaps 4 seconds. He studied the roll of the field to the northeast, the angle of the wood line, the way the frozen ground caught the early light. He pointed northeast. That way, Sarge. Take the lead. No debate. No one had given Trent the authority to navigate. No one had given Mosser the authority to leave the designated route. The field to the northeast might be mined. The wood line might hold German infantry. The compass bearing Trent was pointing toward might terminate in a German regimental command post. They went anyways. What followed took 47 minutes of the most concentrated and silent physical effort any of those men had experienced in the war. Across 3 frozen fields, through one small stream bed where the truck slipped on the ice and Mosser, and 2 other men threw tree branches and fence planks under wheels by hand in complete darkness, working in silence because sound carried further than they could see. Then up a slope that Trent said felt right, the way a man who has walked difficult terrain his whole life develops a feeling for where ground wants to go, and which turned out to be the southern approach to the Bastogne perimeter, 2 kilometers from American engineers who were already preparing their defensive positions for the next morning. They arrived at 22:31 hours. The fuel they carried would allow the artillery batteries at Bastogne to fire for an additional 3 hours on December 20th, one of the most critical days of the entire battle, the day when German armor made its most concentrated push against the perimeter. No one wrote a commendation for Thomas Mosser or Elias Trent that night. There were no orders that had been correctly followed. There was only a situation that had been adapted to, a decision made without authority, and an outcome that mattered in ways neither man would ever fully know. But here is the detail that reframes everything, the hidden key that was not discovered until years later. In the after-action records of the German 5th Panzer Army, compiled in January 1945, there is a specific notation regarding the Bastogne corridor operations. American supply elements exhibited anomalous behavior during breakthrough operations. Individual small units consistently demonstrated navigation and evasion capabilities that suggest specific prior training for breakthrough scenarios. Such training has not been confirmed in captured documentation. There was no such training. There had never been any such training. What the German analysts were observing and attributing to secret American preparation was something they had a word for in their own language: Eigentätigkeit, self-initiative, the very philosophical cornerstone of the doctrine their army had been built on, the very thing their army had stopped doing. And there it was, 5 American fuel trucks crossing a frozen Belgian field at night, found by a Kentucky boy following a feeling in his chest, carrying Moltk's idea home. In the spring of 1945, as Germany collapsed, Allied intelligence teams moved through the surrendering Wehrmacht with a specific directive: interview senior commanders about what had operationally surprised them most about American combat performance. The transcripts exist. Declassified, archived, rarely read cover to cover in the popular accounts. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, commander of Panzer Group Eberbach during the Falaise encirclement, gave an extended interview at Trent Park, England, in September 1945. In it, he said, translated from the original German, At the divisional level and above, the Americans were not exceptional. Their operational planning was methodical, sometimes slow, but below the regimental level, at the company, the platoon, the individual vehicle, they were. I do not have the correct word in any language I speak. Free, they behaved as if each man was also a commander. This is very difficult to fight because you cannot decapitate it. You destroy the head and the body continues to function, continues to decide. He paused. The transcript records a silence of several seconds. We taught this. We used to teach this. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded the Panzer Lehr Division through the campaign in France, one of the most experienced armored officers in the Wehrmacht, was asked specifically about ambush failures against American convoys and supply columns. He said, "The American enlisted man carried decision-making authority that in our system would belong to an Oberleutnant or higher. When we struck their convoys, we were not striking a convoy. We were striking 20 individual command elements that each made a simultaneous decision. This is not how a convoy is supposed to behave. This is not how any organization is supposed to behave." Then came the word he searched for and could not find. The transcript records it as a pause then. They had been given something, or perhaps they had taken it. I cannot determine which. He could not determine which. That uncertainty is the confession. It tells you everything about how disorienting it was to watch, from inside a system built on control, an opposing force that had internalized the one thing your own system had forgotten how to allow. What Bayerlein could not articulate was that the American soldier had not been given the authority to act individually. No order had conferred it. No training program had installed it with formal language and a doctrinal label. It had arrived through something more powerful and more durable than any doctrine: necessity. Survival, the ground-level understanding, carved into these men by 9 months of combat, that in real, moving chaos, the man who acts is almost always better positioned than the man who waits. The Germans had understood this philosophically for 80 years. It was in their manuals. It was in their officer training. It was in the institutional memory of every Prussian general who had served under Moltke. And by 1944, that philosophy had hardened into paperwork, into approval chains, into the silent terror of a command culture that punished wrong decisions more harshly than it punished no decision at all. They were watching their own idea, running on legs they had not trained, across a road they had thought was theirs, and they could not find the word for what they were seeing, because they had stopped living it long enough to forget what it looked like from the inside. This did not end in 1945. It never ends. In 2001, researcher Gary Klein published a study on decision-making in high-stakes environments: emergency rooms, fire stations, military operations. His finding: expert decision-makers in chaotic situations almost never used formal analytical frameworks or waited for complete information. They acted on pattern recognition, on accumulated experience, on what the situation was telling them right now rather than what the procedure manual said the situation should look like. He called it naturalistic decision-making. He might just as accurately have called it what Moltke called it in 1869. In the early 2010s, researchers studying organizational failure in large corporations documented a consistent pattern: Companies where junior employees required approval for every non-routine decision slowed down to the speed of their most risk-averse executive. Companies where junior employees understood the mission deeply and were trusted to act toward it moved at the speed of the actual situation. The bottleneck in failing companies was always the approval structure. The Wehrmacht in 1944 was moving at the speed of Hitler's approval. Thomas Mosser's fuel element moved at the speed of Elias Trent's intuition. In 2016, the United States Marine Corps formally revised its doctrine on decentralized command. They cited explicitly the failures of centralized command in complex operational environments. They cited Auftragstaktik. They cited the very doctrine the Wehrmacht had built and then abandoned. They were, in effect, learning from a ghost. In modern elite military units, from Delta Force to the Israeli Sayeret Matkal to the British SAS, the operational philosophy is built around small units that understand the commander's intent deeply enough to improvise freely toward it in any situation. These organizations obsess over teaching intent, not procedure, because procedure tells you what to do when conditions match the manual. Intent tells you what to do when they don't, and conditions almost never match the manual. Every organization that has lost to a more adaptable opponent has faced the same structural moment, the moment when their own good doctrine, the doctrine that once made them formidable, calcified into bureaucracy, when the permission structure grew faster than the problem it was supposed to solve. The German army did not lose to a better system. It lost to its own best idea, practiced with greater fidelity by the army it was fighting. That is still happening. In every company that requires 13 approval steps before a junior manager can resolve a customer problem, in every institution that promotes people for following rules and punishes people for exercising judgment, in every organization that once moved fast and in growing forgot why it ever could, the convoy is still moving, the ambush is still failing. The only question is which side of that road you are standing on. November 18, 1944, the Moselle Valley. Oberleutnant Werner Hofstadt, pressed against a frozen beech tree in -7 cold, watching a convoy dissolve into a counter-ambush formation before a single shot had been fired. The Americans reacted as if they already knew where we were. He was wrong about what he observed, but he was precisely right about what it felt like. Those drivers didn't know where Hofstadt was. They had no intelligence on his position. No one had briefed them on the specific ambush site. No coded warning had come through their radio. They had not been trained in the specific doctrine that their behavior expressed. What they had was something Hofstadt's army had once given to all its officers and then slowly, quietly, inexorably taken back: the permission to think in the moment, the authority to act on what they saw right now without waiting for someone above them to confirm that what they were seeing was real and that action was authorized. The driver who pulled hard left was not executing a counter-ambush drill. He was doing what Bouchard had done, what Acaffer had done, what Mosser had done, what humans do in every environment where individual judgment has been trusted and practiced, and left intact by a culture that does not punish it. He looked at the situation, felt it somewhere below conscious thought, and moved. The ambush did not fail because American soldiers were better men than German soldiers. Many of those drivers were not soldiers in any traditional sense. They were men with steering wheels and a set of informal agreements, forged over rest stops and shared cigarettes and the accumulated wisdom of not dying, about what three-horn blasts meant. The ambush failed because the Americans were, functionally, 14 individual commanders who happened to be driving the same trucks, and the Germans were, functionally, one commander, Hofstadt, with 31 trained soldiers waiting for his signal. When the signal became irrelevant because events had moved faster than the plan, the 31 soldiers waited, because that was what the culture had taught them to do. You cannot ambush an organization that thinks at that many levels simultaneously. You cannot decapitate something that has 14 heads. Hofstadt survived the war. He was captured in March 1945 in the Saar region and interned at a POW camp in England, where he was interviewed by Allied intelligence officers. They asked him the same question they were asking every German officer they could reach. What surprised you most? He thought for a long time. The transcript records 11 seconds of silence. Then he said, they acted like they owned the ground they were standing on, even when it was not their ground, even when they had been there only 1 hour. They acted as if the decision to hold that ground was personally and entirely theirs to make. Another pause. We taught that. I don't know when they learned it better than us. I don't know when we stopped. He stopped. He had said everything there was to say. He just didn't know it yet. The soldiers named in this script require a word of honesty about what they are. Raymond Bouchard, James Aucaffer, Thomas Mosser, and Elias Trent are composite figures, constructed from the documented experiences of actual soldiers of the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company, the 3,888th Quartermaster Truck Company, the 40th Quartermaster Group, and the various Red Ball Express and Bastogne supply operations of 1944–45. Their actions reflect incidents that occurred with real people, whose names were often not recorded, because the American Army of 1944 was not always attentive to the names of the men who kept it moving without firing a weapon. The Red Ball Express drivers, many of them black soldiers serving in a segregated army, drove in conditions and at risk levels that were not fully acknowledged in their time. Werner Hofstadt and Karl-Heinz Wideman are composite figures drawn from documented German unit after-action reports, officer diaries, and interrogation transcripts from the autumn and winter of 1944. Heinrich Eberbach and Fritz Bayerlein were real men. Their words here are historically reconstructed and condensed from documented post-war interrogations, memoirs, and archived interviews, adapted for clarity of meaning rather than literal quotation. Helmuth von Moltke the Elder was real. His doctrine was real. Its fate was real, the thing that all of them, German and American, officer and driver, general and private, were trying to understand in their different ways from their different sides of frozen roads and official transcripts. It was the same thing, the question of who gets to decide, and what happens to an organization that stops trusting the people closest to the truth. That question did not begin in 1944. It has not ended in 2026. If this story stayed with you, you're carrying something those men spent an entire winter in the cold, in the mud, in the dark, earning the hard way. That seems like the right place to stop.